Have you ever felt completely alone, like no one cares? Have you ever had that moment when even those who promised to be by your side simply turned their backs? So it is. Maybe this story is more similar to yours than you think. There are times when everything falls apart. The people we love most disappoint us. Friends disappear when we need them most. And the silence of those who once said, "Count on me," it hurts more than any words. Rejection hurts, loneliness screams, and deep down, we ask ourselves, has God forgotten me too? But what if I told you that it was exactly in this place of total abandonment that something supernatural happened? That it was when the world turned its back that God decided to write a new beginning. This story is about that, about rejection, about deep pain, but above all about redemption, about how God can use even the contempt of others to reveal his love. Because yes, there is life after abandonment. There is faith after frustration. There is a miracle after the void. And this story you're about to hear now, it might just be what your heart needs, because maybe you are also in your moment of loneliness. Maybe you're tired of giving your all and getting nothing in return. Maybe you're trying to keep the faith, but feeling like you're failing. If this is you, then continue here, because what follows is not just a testimony, it is an answer from God for those who can no longer stand being ignored, for those who feel like they've reached the end of the line, for those who think they are forgotten, but in reality, they are about to be remembered by heaven. Yes, God sees. He knows exactly how you feel, and he has already begun to write your new beginning, even if you can't see it yet. Don't leave this video. What comes now will shake you. It will touch places that are perhaps dormant inside, because when everyone turns their back, that's when God comes into the picture. And before continuing this story, pay attention to one very serious thing. What you will hear here is not just a testimony of overcoming, it's an alert. Because we live in times in which people's coldness has increased, in which abandonment and loneliness have become normal, and many are losing faith without even realizing it. It is no coincidence that you are here. God has called you to wake up, to understand that the signs are being fulfilled and that we are getting closer and closer to the final events. Ignoring this is running the risk of getting lost precisely when we most need to be spiritually attentive. So if this message has touched your heart so far, don't leave it for later. Click on the button like right now. This helps YouTube deliver this video to more people who, like you, need to hear this truth. And more, subscribe to the channel. Here you will follow real transformative testimonies that build faith and open your eyes to the times we are living in. Don't disconnect from this word. What comes now will show you that even abandonment can be the beginning of the miracle. Let's continue. He was no different from many other men who cross our path every day. Those who wake up early, face crowded transport, fight the clock, return home with their bodies bruised and still try to smile at their children. He was the typical man of silent faith who didn't complain, didn't make a fuss. He believed his mission was to provide, to protect, to be present, even if the world was absent to him. He worked as a mechanic in a modest workshop, in a simple neighborhood where each client he acquired was like gold. His grease-stained hands were proof of effort, not misery. And even on the hardest days, he tried to be kind, honest, someone you could trust. But no one imagines the weight a heart carries when it has no one to share the burden with. Married for over 10 years, he had 2 children who were everything to him. Home, at least in the eyes of others, was stable, but it was enough to close the door. For reality to take shape, the wife, overwhelmed with household chores, with young children and the constant fear of unpaid bills, became cold and distant. Complicity gave way to demands. Affection became silence. He was trying to maintain harmony, but everything seemed to slip through his fingers. Small arguments turned into storms, and the worst part, he didn't know how to solve it. I felt that any word was misinterpreted, any attempt at reconciliation sounded forced. At work, the situation also got worse. Old customers no longer appeared. Larger workshops emerged in the region with more resources, modern equipment, and lower prices. He couldn't compete. Debts began to accumulate. Late electricity, rent due, suppliers paying. And that feeling of helplessness began to set in. That feeling that no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you try to do the right thing, the world insists on saying, it's not enough. And as if all this wasn't heavy enough, he began to notice that even his friends were disappearing. Those people who sat at his table at barbecues, who patted him on the back and said, anything, count on me, those were the first to disappear. First, with empty excuses, then with total silence. And so, day after day, he found himself surrounded by emptiness, a silence that screamed. And maybe this part you understand better than you would like, because there is pain that is not noisy. There is suffering that doesn't need tears to be deep. And loneliness, true loneliness, is when we are still surrounded by people, but we feel invisible. He continued to go to church, but not as often. He sat at the back, quietly. I listened to the sermons, but I no longer felt like I used to. The word knocked, but did not enter. The mind was so full of worries that the spirit seemed closed. He still prayed, but without conviction. He prayed like someone following a protocol, like someone trying to keep a flame alive that was almost extinguished. Maybe you know what that's like. Maybe you've prayed with the feeling that your words don't reach the ceiling. The children still saw their father as a hero, but he no longer saw himself that way. I was beginning to believe I was a failure, that he had failed as a husband, as a father, as a man. Self-esteem, previously supported by the pride of being a worker, began to crumble. He no longer groomed himself with the same care. He no longer smiled naturally. Everything in him screamed for help, but no one seemed to hear. He would spend hours in the car, stopped with the engine off, staring into space, thinking about how things got out of hand, how everything he built was falling apart. And what hurt most was the emotional abandonment, the feeling of being forgotten, of having been discarded. And that included God, because in the midst of all this, he began to question, is the Lord still with me? Is the Lord seeing what I'm going through? Does hearing my prayers make a difference? How many people are asking these same questions right now without having the courage to admit it? How many are in the church pews with their faces firm but their hearts broken? And here's an invitation. If you've ever felt this, if you've ever doubted, even for a second, that God was listening to you, comment below. You don't need to give details. Just say, I've felt this, because your sincerity can be the first step to healing. And maybe it will help someone who is also silent, but needs to know. They are not alone. Going back to the story, things would get even worse. There would be times when he would see no way out. What would I think about giving everything away, giving up trying? Because when abandonment hits, it doesn't come alone. It brings with it hopelessness, shame, fear of the future. He got to the point where he could no longer look his children in the eye without feeling a weight on his chest. He started avoiding mirrors, hiding bank statements, avoiding even the presence of God. And it is at this point, exactly at this point, that many believe it is the end, that there's nothing left to do, that the story is already over. But the truth, and this is what I need to tell you now, is that it is exactly in this place of darkness that God begins to act. Because when all the doors close, when everyone turns their back, when even your faith seems too weak, God is still standing. God is still present. And he doesn't just see, he cares. But calm down. The turning point is yet to come. The miracle is yet to come. And I will show you how God, who seemed silent, was preparing something totally new. So stay with me, because now the story will dive into the deep end, and it is there, precisely there, that the light will begin to shine. The workshop, which for years had been his refuge and source of livelihood, began to show signs of exhaustion. Customers, who previously lined up to get their cars repaired, started to disappear. The calls decreased. The sound of tools that filled the entire day was now replaced by an agonizing silence, broken only by the occasional sound of a car passing on the street and heading straight ahead. He tried to keep hope alive, made flyers, advertised on social media, offered discounts, but it seemed like nothing was working. It was as if the entire world had stopped seeing the value of his work, as if his existence was becoming irrelevant. The rental of the space started to fall behind. Suppliers no longer trusted his word. And the debts, oh, they have no patience. They accumulate like waves in a rough sea without giving respite, without waiting for the emotional state to stabilize. Inside the house, tension grew. The wife's gaze, which previously carried admiration, began to reflect frustration. She was also exhausted, and he knew. I knew she couldn't stand seeing the empty fridge, the power outage notices, the children asking why they couldn't go to the cafeteria anymore. He understood everything, but he couldn't do anything, not because I didn't want to, because I couldn't. There comes a time in life when emotional weight paralyzes. Fights became routine, shouts, accusations, slamming doors, until one day she stopped screaming anymore. He just left a note on the table next to a suitcase, and he left. He read and reread that piece of paper with her handwriting, trying to find some hope hidden between the lines. But there was only pain written in short words. She said she couldn't take it anymore, that she needed to think about her and the children, that she wanted him to find himself. And that's when the ground opened up once and for all. When you are surrounded by problems, the little support you have left becomes vital. And losing that support is like losing air. He stared at the empty room, at the still unmade bed, at the forgotten toys in the corner of the room, and the silence of that house seemed to scream, "You are alone." The following days were a mixture of fog and heaviness. He woke up but didn't get up. The coffee was getting cold on the table. His cell phone rang, but he didn't answer, because he knew they were charges. I knew I couldn't pay. I knew I had nothing to say. Time has lost its meaning. The hands turned, but everything seemed to stand still inside him, and little by little, the people who were still trying to keep in touch stopped. Because no one likes to be around someone who has nothing to offer. It's hard to say this, but this is the reality for many. Loneliness doesn't come all at once. It infiltrates through the cracks of pain, occupying the spaces that were previously filled by love, friendship, faith. He tried to seek help, but even the church brothers seemed too busy. Some said, "I'm praying for you," but with their eyes looking at the clock. Others didn't even respond. And once again, he felt the weight of abandonment. Even his own family, uncles, cousins, brothers, began to move away. One of them even said, "You have to manage, we also have our problems." And that sentence, short and direct, hurt more than any debt. Walking the city streets at night alone, with your shoulders hunched and your gaze lost, became a habit. He was aimless. He just walked. Perhaps in the hope of finding some sign, some answer, or simply to escape the emptiness of home. And it is in these moments that the enemy attacks most. When the mind is weak, when the heart is broken, and silence seems to mock faith, thoughts began to emerge. Thoughts he never imagined having. Ideas of giving up everything, not just work, social life, but life itself. He questioned whether it made any difference, if someone would really miss you. And that, my friend, is the darkest abyss a soul can face. But there was a spark, even if it was almost invisible, that still burned. An old memory, perhaps from childhood, that God does not abandon, even if everything seems lost, even if even prayers seem in vain. He didn't have the strength to talk to God, but he could still think about him. And that, although small, was what prevented him from making a tragic decision. In the midst of it all, he felt unrecognizable. Anyone who looked at him now would hardly believe that this was the same man who smiled at church parties, who made jokes during services, who helped paint the walls of the temple with joy. The face was now haggard, the sunken eyes, the shuffling gait, the soul silent. And maybe you who are watching this video are experiencing something similar. Maybe it's not a bankruptcy nor a separation, but it could be the abandonment of friends, a recent loss, an inner crisis that no one sees. Maybe you too are walking alone at night, not through the streets, but through the dark corridors of your mind and heart. And if that's the case, I want to make a request. Comment here. It just says, I'm in that moment too. You don't need to expose yourself, but you need to recognize it, because admitting pain is the first step to experiencing healing, and you are not alone. Here in this community, there are people of faith who pray, who understand, who have passed through the valley and know that it is not the end of the road. Returning to the story, he began to get used to the silence, sitting on the couch for hours, doing nothing, answering with short sentences, not caring about appearance anymore. He stopped going to church. He stopped opening the Bible, not because of a lack of respect, but because of a lack of strength. He no longer expected anything. The only thing he still did was sometimes look up at the sky and wait for a sign, and that signal was closer than he imagined. Sitting on the sidewalk in the cold of the night, with his back against a wall, he seemed part of the landscape. No one stopped to ask if everything was okay. Nobody recognized him anymore, and maybe he didn't even recognize himself. Dirty, with his clothes rumpled, without the strength to even get up, he just stood there. It wasn't the first time I sat in that same spot on the street, but that night there was something different. Not outside, but inside. It was as if something was breaking. Not pride, because that had already disappeared a long time ago, but something deeper. A barrier he didn't even know he had created between himself and God. A pain that, after being ignored for so long, finally found a space to scream. He looked at the ground for long minutes, aimlessly, without reaction, with teary eyes. And when he finally looked up at the dark sky, with heavy clouds that hid any sign of stars, he murmured almost without a voice, "Did my life end here?" The question seemed rhetorical, but it was filled with desperation. He didn't want philosophical answers or advice or human comfort. I wanted something bigger, something only heaven could bring. And there, sitting in the gutter with his heart in ruins, he let the tears fall, not as someone who seeks pity, but as someone who no longer has the strength to hold on. The tears he held in for months, maybe years, finally came out. And in that moment of total surrender, he said, almost whispering, but with all his soul, "God, if you are still there, talk to me." Have you reached that point yet? Have you ever had a moment when words came from your heart without a filter, without rehearsal, without theology? A moment when you stopped trying to be strong and just asked for a sign? If so, comment here. I have already cried out like this. Because often the moment when everything seems to be lost is exactly the moment when heaven approaches. And it could be that your story is about to turn a new page, just like his was. At that moment, something different began to happen. There was no lightning in the sky. No fire fell from above. It wasn't a visible show. It was somewhat subtle, almost imperceptible, but too profound to ignore. It was as if the weight crushing his shoulders had eased, even if just a little. As if that cold and dark place received a gentle breeze. It wasn't a direct answer, but it was a presence. Something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that only those who have been touched by God in the midst of pain can describe. The crying didn't stop, but it changed tone. Now it wasn't just pain, it was relief. It was as if finally someone had listened to him, someone who didn't judge, didn't demand, didn't ask why he let everything get there, someone who just was. And that someone was God, the same God he thought had fallen silent. The same God who seemed absent when everything fell apart. His presence did not come as an accusation. It arrived like an invisible hug, like peace that cannot be explained. He stayed there for hours, lost track of time. The tears dried on her face. The body still ached. The situation was still the same. The debts had not disappeared. The wife was still far away. The friends were still absent. But something inside him had changed. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, he knew he wasn't completely alone. As he looked up at the sky again, he noticed that the clouds were beginning to part. A small gap between them allowed a small beam of lunar light to pass through and illuminate part of the street. That might seem insignificant to anyone passing by, but to him it was like a sign. Not because it was extraordinary, but because at that moment he was sensitive enough to notice the details. And God often speaks in the details. He returned, home in silence. The steps were still heavy, but the heart now carried a seed of hope. And you know, every change starts with a seed. On the way, as he walked slowly along the empty sidewalks, he began to think about what he had just experienced. I tried to rationalize, understand, put it into words, but I couldn't. I just knew that somehow God had heard. And that's what God's presence does. It doesn't answer all questions, but it calms all anxieties. That night, lying on an old mattress without a cover, with the house in absolute silence, he closed his eyes and spoke to God again. But this time, he didn't ask for anything. He just said, "Thank you." And it was the first night after a long time that he was able to sleep peacefully. Can you imagine what it means to sleep peacefully, even when everything remains broken around you? This is something that the world does not understand, but that those who trust in God know well. The peace that passes understanding. Peace that does not depend on paid bills, resolved relationships, a guaranteed future. The peace that comes from the certainty that, despite the chaos, God is present. And here's another question for you to reflect on and comment on. Have you ever had a moment of silent encounter with God? That kind of meeting that no one saw, no one heard, but that you could never forget? Share it here, even if it's just one sentence, because testimonies like this strengthen others, and what God does in one, He can do in many. Returning to the story, the days that followed would still be difficult. He didn't wake up with all the answers. There was no cash envelope at the door, no magical phone call with good news. The workshop was still closed, the heart was still hurting, but something inside him had been restored. Faith, although fragile, had been rekindled, and this spiritual restart would be the beginning of visible restoration. Because when we reach rock bottom and truly cry out to God, without masks, without pride, without formality, heaven responds. And His response sometimes comes in the form of presence, and His presence changes everything. But calm down, there's still more. What God started on that sidewalk was still just beginning. The next morning he woke up with his body still heavy and his mind confused. The night before had been unlike anything I had ever experienced. He had cried out, he had felt something he couldn't explain, but at the same time, there was a new awareness within him. God had listened, and although the situation around them continued without major changes, there was something new, something almost imperceptible, but deeply real, a rekindled flame, a seed planted in the soil of hopelessness. That morning, he decided to leave the house again. Not because I had a specific destination, but because I felt like I needed to breathe, walk, observe the world with eyes that somehow were beginning to see differently. He took the same worn-out pants and the old shirt he used to wear in the workshop and left. The streets were calm, the wind was light, the sun was still shy. He walked slowly, like someone carrying heavy memories on their shoulders, but also like someone waiting, although without knowing exactly what. It was then that everything happened. He was sitting on the sidewalk again, in the same place as the night before, but now watching people pass by, trying to understand how so many people's lives could continue so normally while his was in ruins. And in the midst of that flow of hurried steps, of indifferent looks, a figure stood out. A lady, simple in appearance, gray hair, serene expression. She walked calmly, as if carrying something beyond the ordinary. As he approached, he stopped in front of him. He didn't know her. I had never seen her before. but what she said remained marked in the soul as if it were a tattoo of eternal words. Son, God still has plans for you. It was like a shock. That phrase didn't just come as a word of encouragement, like one of those ready-made messages you find on social media or self-help cards. That phrase had a spiritual weight. It went straight into the heart, as if it cut through all the layers of pain, of doubt, of shame, of discouragement. It was as if God himself had found a way to answer the prayer he had said the night before, there, sitting on the same floor, with his hands on his face and his soul exhausted. He couldn't say anything. He just looked up, surprised, trying to understand if that woman knew him, if someone had told her his story, but no. She didn't know anything, and yet he knew everything, because God, when he wants to speak, does not need explanations, context, presentations. He speaks straight, and whoever listens knows. She took another step closer and gently touched his shoulder. That touch was different. It wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. It was as if, in that simple gesture, God was saying, I'm here, I see you. I haven't given up on you. And at that moment, an indescribable peace invaded him. It wasn't the peace that comes when everything is resolved. It was the peace that comes before, when nothing changed on the outside, but everything began to change on the inside. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever had a moment when God reached you so directly, so personally, that there was no doubt that it was him speaking to you? If so, share it here in the comments. He writes, I have already been touched like this. It may seem simple, but your comment can awaken faith in someone who is in exactly the same place you were. It could be the spark that reignites another flame. Returning to the moment, he remained silent, looking at that lady as if he were in front of an angel. And in a way, maybe it was. She didn't say anything else. He just smiled tenderly, nodded and went on his way. He stood there motionless, not knowing how to react. But something in him was transformed. The feeling of having been seen, heard, touched, renewed within him a strength that he thought he had lost forever. As he looked at the place where the lady had passed, he remembered a verse that his grandmother used to quote in the days when he still attended church more frequently. Call to me, and I will answer you, and I will tell you great and sure things that you do not know. Jeremiah 33:3. That made sense. For the first time in a long time, he felt that the word was alive again. And even though he couldn't recite other texts accurately, he felt within himself that God was, in fact, starting something new. He stood up slowly. He took a deep breath. He looked at the sky, now less crowded. The clouds seemed less dense. The sun was beginning to rise, and all of this might seem like just the weather, but for him it was a symbol. It was as if God was saying, the storm is passing. It's not over yet, but now you are no longer alone. The peace he felt did not erase the pain, but it gave him the courage to face them. He knew he would still have to deal with debts, with his wife's absence, with past mistakes. But now there was something he hadn't had in a long time. Hope. Not that illusory hope that depends on circumstances changing, but that hope that is born from the simple fact of knowing that God is present, acting, leading. That morning, marked by an unexpected encounter, became a turning point. Not because everything changed at once, but because he changed. And when we change on the inside, what's on the outside begins, little by little, to transform too. But what came next was even more surprising, because God doesn't just touch, he guides, he prepares paths, he opens doors where there is no way out. And you need to stay here, because what comes next will show that the reunion with God is just the beginning of a powerful journey, a journey in which even what seemed dead blooms again. And this story is just beginning to reveal the miracles that were being designed in silence. That unexpected encounter with a simple phrase spoken by a woman who seemed to appear out of nowhere had been the trigger for a deep movement in his heart. It was as if finally, after so long of being ignored, someone had looked into his eyes and recognized not only his pain, but also his worth. "Son, God still has plans for you." That phrase never left his head. It sounded like a promise, like a seed planted in the middle of the desert. And he knew, once the presence of God touches someone, no matter how small the contact, nothing stays the same. That night, upon returning home, he sat on the edge of his bed, looked around and realized how much that place carried heavy memories. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like reacting. He picked up a dusty Bible he had received years before, still wrapped in cloth, tucked away at the bottom of a drawer. He opened it without direction, just with the sincere desire to hear something from above. His eyes fell on a verse that seemed to have been written just for him. "Behold, I make all things new." Revelation 21:5. That went down as confirmation. That was it. It was time to start again. But now, not with human strength, but with God's direction. Over the next few days, he began to change his routine. I still didn't have a job. I still didn't have answers for everything, but now I had faith. I woke up and started the day with prayer. They were not elaborate prayers, but true ones. Simple words, but full of delivery. He started reading the Bible every day. Sometimes I read just one verse. Other times he found himself immersed in entire chapters, trying to understand, feed, absorb. And the more I read, the more I understood that what he was experiencing was not the end, but the process. Returning to the church was a difficult but necessary step. The shame still existed, the fear of judgmental looks, the fear of nasty comments. But he went. He sat in the back. Again, only now with a willing heart. And to his surprise, he found no condemnation, found fun. Within the first few weeks, a new prayer cell had been started in the neighborhood, led by a sister who had gone through a similar story. She welcomed him like a younger brother. He didn't demand explanations, he just offered presence, listening, prayer. He started attending meetings even without saying much. Just listening was enough. It was as if, with each meeting, God was rebuilding the pieces of his heart. One day, as he was leaving the cell, one of the participants, a man with a calm appearance but an attentive look, called him aside. He said he was looking for someone trustworthy to take care of the maintenance of a small fleet of vehicles. It wasn't a big workshop, but it was something, an opportunity, a seed. He couldn't believe it, a job, just when he was no longer looking for it, just now that he had decided to prioritize the presence of God in his life. He accepted the proposal with humility and a new cycle began. The routine was different now. He prayed before starting work. I asked God for guidance before making decisions. And the most beautiful thing was that little by little, what he did with his hands began to flourish again. Customers increased, compliments began to arrive, and more than that, he began to be seen with respect again. People who had turned their backs started looking for him, some asking for help, others just wanting to talk. And he, with a renewed heart, received them with the same love he always had, but now with spiritual maturity. In fact, one of the most memorable experiences of this new era was the reunion with an old friend, someone who had completely disappeared during the difficult days. The friend appeared at the door of the improvised workshop, embarrassed, with his head down. He started to speak, but was soon interrupted by a hug. He didn't need to hear excuses. I had already forgiven before I even met again. Because whoever is touched by God learns to forgive without demanding explanations. The days passed, the routine stabilized, faith grew. He came to be known not only as the mechanic down the street, but as a man of faith, a man who didn't give up when everything seemed over. And that caught the attention of a lot of people, including your own family. One of his brothers, who had completely withdrawn, came looking for him. He said he had seen a live stream from the church in which he appeared in praise, and he couldn't believe what he saw. Said, "I left you when you needed me most, but you turned into another man. How did that happen?" He responded with a smile and with a phrase that was now part of his testimony. It was when everyone turned their back that God wrote a new beginning. And if this phrase touched you too, comment here. I believe that God can start my story over again. Because sometimes declaring faith is the first step towards it becoming reality. And it may be that by declaring, you are making space for the sky to move towards you. The most impressive thing is that he no longer sought approval from others. Now, his priority was to please God. And this new attitude, full of humility and dedication, made doors open effortlessly. What previously required so much wear and tear now flowed with ease, because when God takes control, what is heavy becomes bearable. What was impossible starts to make sense. At the new church, he was invited to participate in a life restoration project, a ministry aimed at men in vulnerable situations. And there, he understood that everything he lived had a purpose. The tears, the loss, the loneliness, nothing was in vain. Now he could use his pain as a tool, his fall as testimony, your fresh start as hope. And while he helped others find their faith again, he grew stronger himself. Because when we start to look at others with compassion, God continues to heal the deepest areas of our own soul. But that was just the beginning, because what God was preparing was yet to come. Today, when he looks back, he almost can't believe how much his story has changed. The days when you sat alone on the sidewalk without hope, crying in silence, seemed to belong to another life. That broken, rejected, self-rejecting man, lost among debts, pain and silence, was being shaped, rebuilt, lifted. And today he walks with his head held high, but not out of pride, out of gratitude. He hasn't forgotten where he came from. Quite the opposite. It makes a point of remembering, make a point of counting, because every step you took from rock bottom was guided by the hand of God. He used to think that the worst thing anyone could feel was loneliness, abandonment. But now he understands that often it is precisely there, when men turn their backs, that the sky opens up. In his own words, "The abandonment of men taught me to trust in the love of God." And this phrase is not just beautiful, it is the reality of someone who saw their life fall apart and even so was able to witness a supernatural new beginning. His life has not gone back to the way it was before, not even, because God didn't take him back to where he started. God took him to a new place, a higher, deeper place, more full of meaning. The restoration he experienced was not just material, professional, or emotional. It was a spiritual transformation, a revolution in the soul. That inner void that nothing seemed to fill is now full, filled with the presence of God, full of the certainty that you are no longer alone, and it never will be again. Today, he no longer lives to please others. He lives to glorify the one who lifted him from the dust. Her routine is simple, but full of purpose. He gets up early, prays before anything else, reads the word like someone drinking living water. He goes to work, where he is no longer just a mechanic. He is a counselor, a listener, a voice of faith for the many who arrive there broken, not just with cars, but with broken hearts. People who look for a service and find a word of hope. In the church, it is a reference, not because I have titles or positions, but because I have scars. Scars that today are living testimony of what God can do when someone leaves the pieces of their life in the hands of the potter. Many young people look for him to talk. Older men call him to pray together. Couples ask for advice, and he doesn't have all the answers. But there's the story, and his story now speaks louder than any sermon. Even the family who once turned her face was touched by her transformation. Little by little, bonds were restored. His wife, who had left, began to see him with different eyes. The resentful, bitter, and absent man gave way to someone new, more patient, more serene, more full of God. And it was through this new posture, filled with prayer, that reconciliation took place. It didn't happen overnight, but it was real. God restored not only the marriage, but the home, environment, Today they walk together, not like before, but much better, as partners who know what it's like to lose and what it's like to be found by God. The children, who previously looked at their father with doubt, now admire him, not just for the achievements he achieved, but for the man of faith he became. They see him kneeling, they see him smiling, they see him teaching principles that go beyond any theory. And this, for him, is the greatest inheritance he could leave, the legacy of a living faith tested in fire and strengthened in the presence of God. In moments of prayer, when he is alone in his room, he usually says something in a low voice, just between himself and God. Thank you for letting me get to the bottom, because that's where I really found you. This sentence sums it all up, because the biggest transformation was not outside, but inside. He didn't just become someone better, he became someone reborn, someone who has experienced what it means to die to pride, to self-sufficiency, and live by grace. And that makes me ask you who are watching this far, can you recognize a moment in your life when God turned everything upside down, just to show you that it was He who should be at the center? Comment here, I experienced a turning point with God. Your comment may be exactly what someone else needs to read right now to continue believing, because sometimes what saves someone from falling is knowing that someone has already fallen and been lifted up. Today, he no longer expects life to be easy. He knows fights will come, but now he is certain that he will never fight alone again. God is with him, in every step, in every decision, in every door that opens or closes. He learned to discern God's timing. You learn to trust even when you don't understand. He learned to shut up even when he wants to scream. And that, my friend, is a sign of spiritual maturity. It is a sign that God not only changed history, he changed man. The scene that most represents him today is simple but powerful. Him walking slowly at sunset with a light smile on his face. It's not that forced smile of someone trying to look good. It is the serene smile of someone who has found peace, from those who know that the past has been healed, that the present is full of purpose, and that the future is in God's hands. And this image is not just beautiful, she is prophetic, because it could be yours too. Maybe you are still in the phase of pain, loss, abandonment. Maybe you're still sitting on the sidewalk wondering if God has forgotten you, but the same God who raised him up is hearing his cry right now. What happened to him was no coincidence. It was a promise fulfilled. It was a fresh start. It was a miracle. And the strongest part of it all is knowing that the miracle that God performed in his life didn't end there, because God's purpose always continues, always goes further. And what comes after that, what you will see now, is proof that when God writes a new beginning, he also prepares new destinies. If this story touched your heart, if you somehow felt God speaking to you through this testimony, then you can't leave this video without feeling subscribed to the channel. Here, we share real stories of faith, restoration, miracles, and new beginnings. Each video is a seed planted in your soul, and whoever stays connected reaps the fruits of hope. And if you've come this far, it's because something inside has been achieved. So leave it in the comments. Write like this: God is writing a new beginning in my life. This simple comment could be the answer someone else needs to read. It could be a sign that faith still exists, which is still worth trusting, that God still acts. And remember, what transforms lives isn't just the content, it's the connection. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message and stay with us, because together we will witness many more new beginnings. Amen. And the most impressive thing is that this story doesn't end here. It was just the beginning of something even bigger, because when God decides to rewrite a life, he doesn't just heal the past. He reveals a purpose so grand that everything starts to make sense. In the next video, you will see the moment in which this man, who was once rejected and forgotten, is used by God to transform other lives. And the strongest, you will see how what was your greatest pain became exactly the instrument of your mission. Get ready to understand how a personal miracle becomes a collective mission and how God uses the improbable to accomplish the impossible. This will further strengthen your faith and open your eyes to what He can also do through your life.